translated by Agnes D. Kingston. Book 2, Chapter 9. 100 against 1. Sir Edward was not mistaken. A herd of from 50 to 60 elephants was now behind our train. They advanced in close ranks, and were already so near to the steam house, within 10 yards, that it was possible to survey them minutely. At their head marched one of the largest in the herd, although its height, measured from the shoulder, was certainly not more than 9 feet. As I remarked before, the Asiatic elephant is smaller than the African, which is frequently 12 feet high, and its tusks are in proportion. In the island of Ceylon, a certain number of animals are found deprived of these appendages, but mucknas, which is the name given them, are rare on the mainland of India. Behind the first elephant came several females, who in general are the leaders, while the males remain in the rear. Apparently on this occasion the usual order was changed, because of our presence on the line of march. The males, in fact, have nothing to do with the guidance of the herd. They have not the charge of the young ones. They cannot know when the babies ought to have a rest, nor can they tell what sort of camping place is most fit for them. It is the females who figuratively carry the tusks of the household and direct the great migrations. It was really difficult to answer the question of why they were now on the move, whether it was to seek a more abundant pasture, or to escape the sting of certain venomous insects, or merely a fancy to follow our strange equipage. The country was open enough, and according to their usual custom when they were not in wooded regions, these elephants journeyed by daylight. Before long we should see whether they would stop at nightfall, as we should ourselves be obliged to do. "Hood," I said, "see how our rear guard has increased. Do you still persist in thinking there's no danger?" "Pooh," said the captain. "Why should those animals want to do us any harm? They're not like tigers, are they, Fox?" "Nor even panthers," was the answer of the servant, who always chimed in with his master's ideas. "You seem to be uneasy, Kalagani," said Banks, looking at him. "Cannot the speed of the train be increased?" was the man's only reply. "It would be rather difficult," returned the engineer, "but we will try." So saying, Banks left the veranda and ascended to the howdah in which Storr was standing. Almost immediately the snorts of the behemoth increased, as well as the speed of the train. Very little, though, for the road was rough. But even if our rate had been redoubled, the state of things would have remained the same. The herd of elephants also advanced more rapidly, and the distance between them and the steam house did not diminish. Several hours passed thus, without any important alteration taking place. After dinner we resumed our places on the veranda of the second carriage. The road now stretched away behind us for 2 miles or so in a straight line. Our view of it was no longer intercepted by sudden turnings. To our extreme uneasiness, we perceived that the number of elephants had increased within the last hour. We now counted at least 100. The creatures marched in double or treble file, according to the width of the road, silently, at an even step, with their trunks in the air. It was like the advance of a tide flowing quietly in. All was calm now, to continue the metaphor, but if a tempest lashed into a fury this moving mass, to what danger might we not be exposed? In the meantime, evening came on. There would be no moon, nor would the stars give any light, for a sort of fog or haze shrouded the heavens. As Banks said, it would be impossible to follow such a difficult road in the dark. He resolved, therefore, to halt as soon as the valley widened, or we met some gorge into which we could go, and allow the alarming-looking herd to pass us and continue their migration to the south. But would they do so? Might they not halt in or near our encampment? This was the great question. With nightfall came a sort of agitation among the elephants, which we had not observed during the day. A sort of roar, powerful but dull, escaped from their mighty lungs. To this uproar succeeded another peculiar noise. "What does that mean?" asked the colonel. "That is the sound they make," replied Kalangani, "when they are in the presence of an enemy." "And it is we. It can only be we whom they consider as such," said Banks. "I fear so," replied the native. The sound now resembled distant thunder. It recalled that which is produced in the side scenes of a theater by the vibration of sheets of iron. Rubbing the extremity of their trunks on the ground, the elephants sent forth prolonged breaths with a deep and sullen roar. It was now 9 in the evening. We had reached a sort of little plain, almost circular and half a mile in width, from which debouched the road to the Lake Pretoria, near which Kalangani had proposed our halting. But this lake being still 10 miles off, it was hopeless to think of reaching it that night. Banks now gave the signal to stop. Behemoth became stationary, but he was not unharnessed. The fires were not even raked out. Store received orders to keep up the pressure so that the train might move on again at a moment's notice. We were thus ready for any emergency. Colonel Monroe retired to his room. Banks and Hood did not care to go to bed, and I preferred setting up with them. All our servants were also afoot. But what could we possibly do if the elephants took it into their heads to attack the steam house? For the first hour a dull murmur continued around our encampment. The herd was evidently spreading over the little plain. Were they merely crossing it and pursuing their way southwards? "That's possible, after all," said Banks. "It is even more than probable," added Captain Hood, whose optimism was never at fault. Towards 11 o'clock the sounds began to diminish, and at 10 minutes past it had totally ceased. It was a perfectly calm night, so that the slightest noise would have reached our ears. Nothing was to be heard but the panting of Behemoth, and nothing was to be seen but the sparks which flew occasionally from his trunk. "Well," remarked Hood, "wasn't I right? Those fine fellows have taken their departure." "And a pleasant journey to them," I rejoined. "I am not at all sure they are gone," said Banks, shaking his head, "but we must find out." Then, calling to the engine driver, "Store," he said, "the signal lamps." "Aye, aye, sir." In 20 seconds' time the 2 electric lights blazed from Behemoth's eyes, and by automatic mechanism were directed in turn to every point of the horizon. There lay the elephants in a great circle round Steam House, motionless, perhaps asleep. The brilliant light turned upon their dark bodies seemed to animate them with supernatural life. By a natural optical illusion the monsters assumed gigantic proportions, rivaling our Behemoth. Aroused by the glare, they started as if touched by a fiery sting. Trunks were raised and tusks pointed as if the creatures were making ready for a rush at the train. Roars issued from each vast throat. A sudden fury communicated itself to all, and round our encampment soon arose a deafening concert, as if 100 clarions at once were sounding a startling call. "Out with a light!" called Banks. The electric current was suddenly interrupted, and as suddenly the commotion ceased. "They are there, you see, camped in a circle," said the engineer, "and there they will still be at daybreak." "Hum," observed Captain Hood, whose confidence appeared to be somewhat shaken. What was to be done next? Kalangani was consulted. He did not attempt to conceal the anxiety he felt. Could we leave the encampment under the cover of darkness? That was impossible. Besides, what use would it be? The herd of elephants would certainly follow us, and the difficulties of the road would be far greater than by day. It was therefore agreed that the departure should not be attempted until dawn. We would then proceed with all possible prudence and celerity, but without startling or offending our formidable retinue. "And suppose those animals persist in escorting us?" I asked. "We will endeavor to reach some spot where Steam House can be put out of their reach," answered Banks. "Shall we find such a spot before we get to the Vandayas?" asked the captain. "There is one," said the Hindu. "What is it?" demanded Banks. "Lake Pretoria." "At what distance is it?" "About 9 miles." "But elephants swim," replied Banks, "perhaps better than any other quadruped. They have been seen to keep themselves on the surface of the water for more than half a day. Now is it not to be feared that they might follow us into Lake Pretoria, and thus the situation of Steam House be made still more serious?" "I cannot see any other way of escaping their attack," said the native. "Then we will try it," said the engineer. It was indeed the only thing to be done. The elephants might perhaps not venture to swim after us, and if they did, we might outstrip them. We waited impatiently for day, which was not long in appearing. No hostile demonstration was made during the night, but at sunrise not an elephant had stirred, and Steam House was surrounded on all sides. All at once a general move was made, as if the creatures were obeying a word of command. They shook their trunks, rubbed their tusks on the ground, made their toilet by squirting water all over their bodies, gathered several mouthfuls of the thick grass with which the ground was covered, and finally approached so near to the steam house that we could have touched them through the windows. Banks, however, expressly forbade us to provoke them. It was important that no pretext should be given for a sudden attack. In the meantime, several elephants pressed up close to Behemoth. They evidently wished to ascertain what the enormous animal, now standing so motionless, could be. Did they consider him as a relation? Did they suspect that he was endowed with marvelous power? On the day before, they had had no opportunity for seeing him at work, for the first ranks had always kept a certain distance from the rear of the train. But what would they do when they heard him snort and bellow, when his trunk ejected torrents of vapor, when they saw him raise and set down his great feet and begin to march, dragging the two great vans after him? Colonel Munro, Captain Hood, Kalagani, and I took our places in the forepart of the train. Sergeant McNeil and his companions were at the back. Calluth, at the furnaces, kept up the supply of fuel, so that the pressure of the vapor had already reached 5 atmospheres. Banks was in the howdah with store, and kept his hand on the regulator. The moment for departure came. At a sign from Banks, the driver touched the spring, and an ear-piercing whistle resounded through the air. The elephants raised their heads, then, drawing back a little, they left the way open for a few feet. A jet of vapor started from the trunk. The wheels of the machine were put in motion. Behemoth and the train advanced together. None of my companions will contradict me when I assert that there was at first a lively movement of surprise among the foremost animals. A wider passage opened, and the road appeared free enough to allow the train to proceed at a pace equal to a horse's trot. But at the same moment all the Proboscidean herd, to use an expression of the captain's, moved too, both in front and rear. The first took the lead of the procession, the rest followed the train. All seemed quite determined not to abandon it. At the same time, as the road was here wider, others walked at the sides, like horsemen accompanying a carriage. Male and female mingled, of all sizes, of all ages, adults of 25 years, and grown men of 60, old fellows of more than 100, and little ones who had not yet left their mother's side, but sucking with their lips, and not with their trunks, as is sometimes supposed, got their breakfast as they trotted along. The entire troop kept a certain order, not hurrying, but regulating their pace to that of Behemoth. "If they escort us like this to the lake," said Colonel Munro, "I shall make no objection." "Yes," replied Kalangani, "but what will happen when the road narrows?" In this lay the danger. No incident occurred during the 3 hours which were employed in traveling 8 out of the 10 miles to Lake Pretoria. 2 or 3 times only a few elephants stood across the road, as if it was their intention to bar it, but Behemoth pointed its tusk straight at them, sputtered out smoke in their faces, advancing all the time, so that they thought better of it, and started out of his way. At 10 o'clock, 2 miles only lay between us and the lake. There, at least so we hoped, we would be in comparative safety. Of course, if no hostile demonstration was made before we reached the lake, Banks intended to leave Pretoria on the west without stopping there, so as to quit the region of the Vindhyas the next day, from thence to the station of Jubbulpore, but was but a few hours' journey. I may here add that the country was not only very wild, but absolutely a desert. Not a village, not a farm, the insufficiency of pasture accounting for this, not a caravan or even a solitary traveler. Since our entry into this mountainous part of Bundelkund, we had not met a single human being. About 11 o'clock, the valley through which the steam house was passing between two great spurs of the chain began to narrow. The danger of our situation, already fraught with so much to cause uneasiness, was now aggravated. If the elephants had simply gone on in front or followed the train, the difficulty would not have occurred, but those marching alongside could not remain there. We should either crush them against the rocky sides of the road or tumble them over the precipices which bordered it in some places. Instinctively they tried to get either forward or back, the consequence being that it was no longer possible either to advance or retreat. "This complicates matters," remarked the colonel. "Yes," said Banks, "we are now under the necessity of breaking through the herd." "We'll break through, dash into them," exclaimed Captain Hood. "By Jove, Behemoth's iron tusks are worth much more than the ivory tusks of those idiotic brutes." The Proboscideans were now only idiotic brutes in the eyes of our lively and changeable captain. "No doubt," said McNeil, "but we are 1 against 100. "Forward, whatever happens," cried Banks, "or the herd will trample us underfoot." Several puffs of steam now gave notice of more rapid movement on Behemoth's part. His tusks ran into the elephant nearest him. A cry of pain burst from the animal, which was answered by the furious clamor of the whole herd. A struggle, the issue of which we could not foresee, was imminent. We had our weapons already in our hands, the rifles loaded with explosive ball, and the revolvers charged. We were thus prepared to repel any aggression. The first attack was made by a gigantic male of ferocious aspect, who, planting his hind feet firmly on the ground, turned against Behemoth. "A Goonish!" cried Kalagani. "Pooh! He only has 1 tusk," replied Hood, shrugging his shoulders disdainfully. "He is more the terrible," answered the native. Kalagani had given to this elephant a name which hunters use to designate the males which have only 1 tusk. These are animals particularly reverenced by the natives, especially when it is the right tusk which is wanting. Such was the case with this one, and, as Kalagani said, it was, like all its species, uncommonly fierce. This was soon proved. The Goonish uttered a trumpet note of defiance, turned back its trunk, which elephants never use for fighting, and rushed against the Behemoth. His tusk struck the iron side with such violence as to pierce through, but meeting with the thick armor of the inner plating, it broke against it. The whole train felt the shock. However, it continued to advance and drove back the Goonish, which boldly but vainly endeavored to resist it. His call had been heard and understood. The whole mass of animals stopped, presenting an insurmountable obstacle of living flesh. At the same moment, the hinder troops, continuing their march, pressed violently against the veranda. How could we resist such a crushing force? Those which still remained at the side raised their trunks, and twining them around the uprights of the carriages, shook them violently. It would not do to stop, or it would be soon all up with the train, but we had to defend ourselves. No hesitation was possible. Guns and rifles were instantly aimed at our assailants. "Don't waste a single shot," cried the captain. "Aim at the root of the trunk, or the hollow below the eye. Those are the vital parts." Captain Hood was obeyed. Several reports rang out, followed by yells of pain. 3 or 4 elephants hid in a vital spot had fallen behind us and at the side, a fortunate circumstance such that their corpses did not obstruct our road. Those in front drew to one side, and the train continued its advance. "Reload and wait," cried Hood. If what he ordered us to wait for was the attack of the entire herd, there was no long delay. It was made with such violence that we almost gave ourselves up for lost. A perfect chorus of hoarse and furious trumpeting suddenly burst forth. One might have supposed them to be an army of those fighting elephants, which, when possessed by the excitement called "must," are treated by the natives so as to increase their rage. Nothing can be more terrible, and the boldest elephantador, trained in Guickwar for the express purpose of fighting these formidable animals, would certainly have quailed before the assailants of the steam house. "Forward!" cried Banks. "Fire!" shouted Hood. And with the snorts and shrieks of the engine were mingled the crack of our rifles. It was next to impossible to aim carefully, as the captain had advised. In such confusion, every ball found a mark in the mass of flesh, but few hit a mortal part. The wounded animals, therefore, redoubled their fury, and to our shots they answered with blows of their tusks, which seriously damaged the walls. To the report of the guns, discharged both in front and rear of the train, and the bursting of the explosive balls in the body of the animals, was joined the hissing and whistling of the steam. Pressure rapidly increased. Behemoth dashed into the bellowing crowd, dividing and repelling it. At the same time, his movable trunk, raising and falling like a formidable club, dealt repeated blows on the quivering bodies which he pierced with his tusks. Thus we advanced along the narrow road. Sometimes the wheels seemed about to stick fast, but on we struggled till we were within a short distance of the lake. "Hurrah!" shouted Captain Hood, like a soldier who was about to dash into the thick of the fight. "Hurrah! Hurrah!" we echoed. All at once I caught sight of a huge trunk darting across the front veranda. In another minute Colonel Munro would be seized by this living lasso and be dashed under the monster's feet. Just in time, however, Kaligani bounded forward and severed the trunk by a vigorous blow from a hatchet. After this, while all were taking part in common defense, the Hindu never lost sight of Sir Edward. In his unfailing devotion and exposure of his own person to shield the colonel, he showed how sincere was his desire to protect him. Bohemus' power and strength of endurance were now put to the proof. How he worked his way like a wedge, penetrating through the mass, and at the same time the hindermost elephants butted at us with their heads. The train advanced, not only without stopping, although with many a jolt and shock, but even faster than we could have hoped. All at once a fresh noise arose amid the general din and clamor. A party of elephants were crushing the second carriage against the rocks. "Join us! Join us!" shouted Banks to those of our friends who were defending the back of the steam house. Already Fox, Galmi, and the sergeant had darted into our house. "Where is Parizard?" asked the captain. "He won't leave the kitchen," answered Fox. "He must come. Haul him along." Doubtless our cook considered it a point of honor not to leave the post which had been confined to him, but to attempt to resist Galmi's powerful arms, when those arms had once grasped him, would have been as much use as to endeavor to escape from the jaws of a crocodile. Monsieur Parizard was soon deposited in the drawing-room. "Are you all there?" cried Banks. "Yes, Sahib," returned Galmi. "Cut through the connecting bar." "What, and leave half our train behind?" cried Captain Hood. "It must be done," answered Banks. The bar was cut through, the gangway hacked to pieces, and our second carriage was detached. Not too soon. The carriage was crushed, heaved up, capsized, the elephants ending by pounding it beneath their feet. Nothing but a shapeless ruin was left, obstructing the road. "Hum!" uttered Hood in a tone which would have made us laugh had the occasion allowed of it. and those animals wouldn't crush a ladybird. If the maddened elephants treated the first carriage as they had treated the last one, we now knew the fate which awaited us. "Pile up the fires, Cloth," called the engineer. A few more yards, a last effort, and Lake Pretoria might be reached. Storr opened wide the regulator, thus showing Behemoth what was expected of him. He made a regular break through the rampart of elephants, and not contenting himself with merely thrusting them with his tusks, he squirted them with jets of burning steam, as he had done to the pilgrims in the Falgo, scalded them with boiling water. It was magnificent. The lake lay before us. 10 minutes would put us in comparative safety. The elephants no doubt knew this, which was proof in favor of the intelligence Captain Hood had argued for. For the last time they bent all their effort to capsize our train. Still, we used our firearms. The balls fell on the animals like hail. Only 5 or 6 elephants now barred our passage. Many fell, and the wheels ground over the earth red with blood. These last remaining brutes had now to be got out of the way. "Again! Again!" shouted Banks to the driver. At this Behemoth roared, as if his inside was a workshop full of spinning jennies. Steam rushed through the valves under the pressure of 8 atmospheres. To increase this would have burst the boiler, which already vibrated. Happily, this was needless. Behemoth's power was now irresistible. We could actually feel him bounding forward with the throbbing of the piston. The remains of the train followed him, jolting over the legs of the elephants, which covered the ground, at the risk of being overset. If such an accident had happened, Steam House and its inhabitants would most certainly have come to an untimely end. Mercifully, this we were saved from. The edge of the lake was safely reached. Into it dashed our brave Behemoth, and the train floated on the surface of its tranquil waters. "Heaven be praised!" ejaculated the colonel. 2 or 3 elephants, blind with fury, rushed after us into the lake, attempting to pursue on its surface those whom they had vainly endeavored to annihilate on dry land, but Behemoth's feet did their work well. The train drew gradually from the shore, and a few well-directed shots soon freed us from the marine monsters, just as their trunks were getting closer than was pleasant to our back veranda. "Well, Captain," remarked Banks, "what do you think of the gentleness of Indian elephants?" "Pooh!" said Hood. "They aren't worth being called wild beasts. Just suppose 30 tigers or so in the place of those 100 pachyderma, and I wager my commission that by this time not one of us would be alive to tell the tale." End of Book 2, Chapter 9. Reading by Dan Mason of Midland, Michigan.